Okay, so my service video is focused towards overfishing. I will be covering why it's a global issue of importance, what it generally looks like, and kind of how we can help as humans, and kind of from our standpoint, what we can do. Bear with me, I am a little sick and I may cough or sniffle through, so just pay no attention to that. So let's move on to first slide is why is overfishing a problem? So the first thing is that it's collateral damage to oceans and ecosystems. This meaning that ecological extinctions are happening. It precedes all human activity that we have going on, whether that be pollution, water quality, climate change, etc. It's a loss of a major food source. People all around the world rely on fish as a vital source of protein every day. Many of these countries may have a harder time farming animals on land, so kind of looking at third world countries, their lives depend on fish and fishing. So not only do people rely on fish, but other predators in the ocean rely on fish as well. You take away the smallest part of any food chain, and eventually the largest predators can become the prey. So, like anything that's overused, the natural resource will eventually be depleted. So, like looking at oil, that's eventually going to be gone. It's the same with fish. This poses adverse effects on biomass and how rapidly any life form can grow back and or reproduce. Earth is made up of 70% oceans, and that's about 3/4 of our planet. So when the oceans change, the rest of the world has no other choice but to change with it. And unfortunately, these aren't going to be good changes, and we're going to start to see that more and more as time goes on. Oceans also contain 80% of all life on Earth, and most of this is still unexplored, so we don't really even know all the species that we could potentially be killing off by overfishing. And our final point is jobs. People fish for a living, and so when there's no more fish to catch, millions of people are going to lose their jobs, and that's just going to go on to upset economies surrounding the areas, which will eventually upset economies that are further away from, so like an American economy. That'll take a toll as well. So next slide is, what does overfishing look like? On the slide, I have the scientific scientific definition, which is a form of overexploitation where fish stocks are reduced to below acceptable or sustainable levels. This just meaning what it is, catching too many fish to the point that they don't reproduce quick enough to the point that they don't recover, or they recover far less quickly. Surprisingly, a large chunk of the common public actually believe that overfishing is only a minor issue that we can resolve with time, and unfortunately, that's super far from the truth. Many official figures actually lead the public on to believe silly facts like fish reproduce quicker than other animals, or since we haven't explored half the oceans already, there's got to be fish in those areas that we can eat when the time comes. And like, as realistic as they sound, like, they're also silly and they're just really not true. It seems like such a minuscule problem on the surface, but the deeper you dive, the more you see how threatening it all actually is towards us. So on the slide here, you can see I have, it looks just kind of like a fifth grade picture. There's 5 boats, there's 3 nets, and there's 1 fish. And as like over exaggerated as it looks, this is actually low key what fishing is starting to look like in the oceans now. On the left side, you'll see over here, I just have some like little statistics. A little scary when you actually see them in print, but so for example, 2050 is the year experts say fisheries will collapse. 80% of the world's fish stocks are already exploited. 300,000 whales and dolphins are killed each year by bycatch, which we'll focus on in the next couple slides. So yeah, just for a little extra perspective, just good to take a look at. Next slide is fishing early on. So the earliest accounts of overfishing actually occurred back in the 1800s. Fishermen decimated whole populations of fish, but especially whales. So if you think back to like the Moby Dick era, when they were mass killing whales for oil, that's kind of how it started. And after people realized that a resource with such an abundance could be hunted to the point of extinction, more laws and regulations were set into place for future reference. In the early 20th century, fishing seemed to be endless once again. It was at its highest abundance. The flow never ended. But by 1989, over 90 million tons of fish had already been taken from the oceans. Popular fisheries were beginning to collapse, and by 2003, industrial fishing had reduced a number of large ocean fish to only 10% of their pre-industrial population. So you'll see here on the left side, I reference the 1992 collapse of the northern cod fishery. This was just a local event somewhere in Canada. They depleted a whole species of cod by 1992, and 20 years later, the species still has not fully recovered, and there has been no fishing in that area since then. So that just kind of shows how slow the process can actually be. Okay, next slide. Why is this happening? So one of the major reasons overfishing is happening is generally just due to global lack of management. This meaning that the overcapacity of fishing vessels, equipment, and technology play a huge part. We have enough commercial fishing boats for 3 Earth-sized planets, and we are only inhabiting 1. Unsustainable fishing involves large fishing nets that catch more than just the desired fish in mind. So this is what we mean by bycatch. It's an unfactored problem that many fishermen often just discard as no big deal. It can consist of turtles, sharks, crabs, corals, mollusks, basically anything that you catch at the bottom of the ocean. They are normally just discarded back into the ocean, and by this point, they're either severely injured or most likely dead. So think of a business that requires fresh catches of fish every day. You automatically think of the sushi industry. Sushi restaurants cannot afford to sell old fish, or else they would not have business. So Pacific bluefin tuna, for example, is a sushi staple in any restaurant or fish house you walk into. Today, it's a poster child for overfishing, and they're on the verge of extinction. So you'll see here, I have a little statistic. Pacific bluefin tuna is only at 2% of its former population. Like, that's crazy, and that only happened in like 100 years. Now, on the contrary, you would think that sushi chefs would come out as proponents for sustainable fishing, but it's really kind of rare. Although there are far more sushi chefs that would gladly accept all the weird fish that we consider bycatch. They don't get the opportunities to accept those fish though, since most American fishermen assume that all people want is yellowtail salmon, tuna, and they're just going through regulation. So they automatically assume that they just kind of have to throw away anything that's not in the main fish groups. Farmer fish could be utilized, but it's just being tossed away by garbage because it's not deemed pretty enough for a sushi plate. So you'll see I have another little statistic over here. It says bottom trawling, which is just bottom fishing. That's when you're catching all the extra bycatch. That alone has extinguished 10,000 species. Like, that's a crazy number. So it says here on the left side in my image, about 25% of total global catch is actually discarded. So when you think about it, we're only using 75% of the fish we actually catch. That's a huge waste. Okay, next slide. This is just another image, just kind of gives you fishing by the numbers, what it looks like, just for a little more perspective. So it says here, 8 southern Atlantic species in severe decline. Over here, tragedy of the commons, kind of referring back to the 1992 cod fishery collapse. 70% of the earth is water, 30% is land. That's a really big number to deal with. Between 1950 and 2011, 90% of fish stocks have decreased, which that's hardly a lifetime right there. Okay, next slide is future outlook. So the entire world's fisheries are expected to collapse and be diminished within the next 40 years, which is 2048 is kind of the year that we're expected to just be done with fishing altogether. That's not very far away, unfortunately. The worldwide fishing industry employs close to 200 million people, and it generates around $80 billion a year. A portion of the industry's revenues come from subsidies, and these usually come from countries like Japan, the European Union, and China. 97% of fishers are in developing countries, so kind of referring back to the third world countries. That's where most of our fishermen are actually coming from. 1 billion people depend on seafood as a primary source of protein. So that means that 1 billion more people a year are going to go hungry if we lose our fish source. So adding that onto the 853 million people that are already starving, that's a pretty big number to deal with. We'll have an economic problem, obviously, as well as a collapsed ecosystem, which is probably the worst of it. Some Japanese business owners have actually gone as far as freezing large quantities of bluefin tuna for future supplies when the species finally goes out. And not only is this illegal, but it's also just crazy that people are taking these measures rather than just trying to find a solution to the problem. Okay, next slide is, can we stop it or prevent it any further? Of course, like any large environmental issue, if we all act upon it now, the consequences will be far less dire. A general outline of ways we could help from our position is aggressive management, law enforcement, governing catches, and increased use of aquaculture. So here in our next slide, when I say aquaculture, this is referring to the act of breeding, rearing, and harvesting plants and animals in all types of water environments. This can include ponds, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Hatchery and shellfish are grown to market-sized ponds, tanks, cages, or raceways. Stock reformation is a form of aquaculture that releases these types of fish that are kind of reproduced, and it's throwing them back into the wild to rebuild populations or coastal habitats. So like oyster reefs, for example, are really popular with stock reformation. Aquaculture can also produce ornamental fish for the aquarium trade, as well as growing plant species that can be utilized as food. This isn't as huge of a focus, but it still kind of takes a burden off of trying to create enough fish for people to eat alone. So U.S. marine aquaculture focuses more specifically on culturing of species that are already in the oceans, which is generally where farming takes place. So if you look at these little cage systems, all the fish are kind of like set in this cage, and they can live in their natural habitat and grow to their natural size. They can breed and reproduce, and they can be taken as food or re-released, etc., etc. Freshwater aquaculture is the same concept, only it's in rivers, lakes, and ponds. And there's some basic regulations, so like the farm shouldn't be an ecological hazard to the surrounding environment, and finding generic feed for the fish instead of depleting another source is kind of vital, but that's all in due time of kind of learning the process. Okay, next slide is strict regulations and management. So the idea of rights-based management has been introduced to many fisheries already. How it works is fishermen receive a secure share of the catch and in return agree to adhere to strict limits that allow fish populations to rebuild. It's like a long-term ownership stake, so when the fishery grows, the fishermen's stakes will increase. It's already transforming handfuls of fisheries in the U.S., which is great. Today in America, more than 2/3 of the seafood supply is actually sustainable, which is like it's an awesome statistic, and it's just kind of going up from now. So more than 100 species are on the road to recovery. Other countries are adopting the idea of catch shares, so like Australia, Belize, Chile, Denmark, and Namibia are kind of crucial in like helping take these steps too. So you'll see here I just have a table. It kind of shows traditional management and what fishing rights would look like. So like when to fish, how much to fish, and just the incentives to follow. So they're pretty simple, and when they're applied, they've actually been shown to work. So this is something else we could work towards. Next slide is other factors we may face. So unfortunately, there are still some other components we have to factor in. So like illegal fishing, for example, is still a huge issue. In the future, it doesn't look too promising. Fishermen will go out of international waters where there are no borders and continue to rapidly take away species of fish. Climate change and overfishing go hand in hand with one another. If climate gets worse, the oceans get worse. Whereas if the oceans get worse, climate change only decreases or increases, excuse me. So more species will begin to suffer either way. And this could affect certain issues such as like ocean acidification, temperatures, sea level, etc. Another issue is just kind of educating the general public on such a matter. Unfortunately, we live in a time where privileged civilians are used to having their fresh out of the sea fish waiting for them. And it's a pretty lavish lifestyle to be living, and we can no longer afford to do that as much as we think we can. People don't realize that what was once abundant is now struggling to stay afloat. So passing on the knowledge and making the public aware is a big part of steps moving forward. On that note, turning plans into physical acts is also super crucial. We can stand around and talk all day about what's wrong and how we should fix it, but nothing will actually be accomplished if we do nothing. So, pushing for stricter regulations and fish management is a must, as well as making matters apparent to a larger sum of the population. So, in conclusion, overall, it's pretty clear that there is an issue at hand, and changes must be made sooner than rather than later, because unfortunately, we've kind of run out of laters. You can take any global issue, whether it be pollution, deforestation, fossil fuels, or population control, and say that they need to be fixed yesterday. And the same goes with fishing, or overfishing for the matter. To me personally, overfishing is super crucial to pay attention to because it's a problem that involves over 70% of our planet. Without the oceans, we're all in huge trouble. Without oceans, all our other problems will only grow far more rapidly. So, like, once the fish are gone, we're going to start to see more physical changes to the earth, and then we're going to notice how personally affected we actually can be by not having the oceans, or fish for that matter. So, overall, we must act now. If you enjoy having your thin cut yellowtail sashimi or eating that colorful rainbow roll, then I really suggest taking an interest in doing your part to make a change. Helping now before it's too late is just, it's the best and only thing we can do. So, save the fishies, however you want to look at it, but it's one of the biggest steps that we can take towards saving our Earth. So, yeah, that was my overall presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting, or as interesting as I did. I had a really good time kind of studying this, and it's really inspired me. So I hope I could kind of do my part and kind of show you guys that as well. So thank you a ton.